I'd like to begin with you putting your concerns out there that you've expressed about putting the mental back in mental health. What are you getting at there?
Okay, well, yeah, that's a topic I've been really kind of consumed with lately, and it kind of one way to frame that problem is in terms of something that happened in 1917 and something that happened in 2018, so a century apart. The first thing, 1917. Sigmund Freud said something like, if we could understand anxiety, it would shed light on the whole of mental existence. And then in 2018, some colleagues of mine who were not particularly happy with the way I'd been talking about research on fear and anxiety, said that LeDoux was sending psychiatry back to the dark ages of subjectivity.
Oh,
And
no,
so,
not that.
so it's an interesting thing because if you follow the history of psychotherapy, of course, Freud had a big role in the early 20th century. But then in the mid 20th century, psychiatry decided it needed to be more scientific. So medications were coming along and so forth.
Yeah.
And who was like testing medications? Well, it was mostly people who had been trained as behaviorists and knew how to test animal behavior were hired by drug companies, and they would put animals through the testing apparatus. And the idea was, of course, at that time that the mind was irrelevant because all we needed to understand was behavior.
Yeah.
And so that was one factor that was going into how psychiatry was going to interpret these results from animal behavior. But the other factor was that psychiatry was trying to put Freud in the rearview mirror in general, because there was kind of a backlash against the whole Freudian thing. But rather than getting rid of the stuff that was kind of a little out there, all the sex and all the things he was talking about that were less acceptable, they got rid of the entirety of subjective experience. So behavior therapy came along, drug therapy came along, cognitive behavior therapy came along eventually. And cognitive behavior was kind of more of a kind of addressing that issue in a sense of putting the mental back into what had been happening for the decade or so before. But as
they kind of shoehorned it in.
They shoehorned it in, but then it kind of became more metric driven anyway, right? So you had to have ways to characterize everything. So it was about measuring behavior, measuring various things, using these metrics to get insurance companies to pay for treatment and so forth. So I think, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a therapist, but I just, I read a lot about this stuff and I try to understand it from the point of view of the brain. And my perspective is that, until we accept that people go to therapy because they feel bad and that changing their behavior can help, but it's not necessarily going to solve the problem of how they feel, we've got a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And, as a clinician, I have a particular bias towards subjective behavior or subjective experience, that is.
Right. No, I think every therapist wants to make their patient feel better. The question is, how do you do that, right? And so I think that, when too much is done in a session, for example, if you have a patient with a spider phobia, for example, those patients don't like to see spiders, obviously. So there's a kind of resistance to doing CBT on them in extinction therapy because they have to be in the room with the spider. But suppose you could subliminally present that spider to the person's brain. And we know that those kinds of dangerous signals will go to the part of the brain I've worked on for a long time, the amygdala. We might be able to extinguish the amygdala subliminally. So the patient wouldn't know the spider is there because it's being presented outside of conscious awareness by the quick flashes and so forth.
Yeah.
And so then metaphorically, we would have tamed the amygdala. I mean, a lot of other parts of the brain are involved in that kind of stuff, but just as a metaphor, think of it as taming the amygdala. Now, once you've done that, then the patient is more comfortable with spiders in the room and talking about them and not being hyper aroused and all of that and jittery. But now you can talk to the patient about their memories about spiders and try to change those memories a bit, like their kind of conception of themselves as someone who's afraid of spiders, and they could see that they have now been released a bit from the spiders by the treatment that was done before. And so you can begin to shape memory. In other words, taming the hippocampus, again, metaphorically, changing memory. Now, once you've done those two things, I think maybe the brain is now ready for good old talk therapy, because you've kind of gotten some of the impediments out of the way.
Yeah.
And I think even medications could be useful there. But my opinion about what medications actually do is it's kind of like you go to a restaurant in New York, where I live, Brooklyn, and the music is always too loud, right? So some old guy like me will ask the waiter to turn it down. And so the waiter turns it down. It's the same awful heavy metal song you didn't want to hear in the first place, but it's not as annoying, right? And so I think that's what the drugs might be particularly effective at, is turning down the volume of the state of anxiety. They're not going to get rid of the subjective experience of anxiety, but it's just going to be a little less annoying. So I think there's a lot we can do, but we need to, I think, reconceptualize a lot of the way we've thought about fear and anxiety. And that's what I've been doing in my work since 2012, when I wrote this article called Rethinking the Emotional Brain.
Yeah,
now,
and somewhere in there, you got tagged as Mr. Amygdala, and that was part of what you were trying to escape, right?
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, I love the amygdala. I think it's it's been very good to me. If you remember Saturday Night Live in the 70s, there was a guy who was on. His name was Derek something or other. I think I forget, but he played this this baseball player. Baseball has been very good to me. Baseball has been very good. The amygdala has been very good to me. It's like,
right.
But what it's good for has not been exactly what I was thinking, the way I was thinking about it. I did my PhD studying split brain patients with Mike Gazzaniga in the 1970s. And from that work, I came to think of emotions as cognitive interpretations of situations.
Right.
And so the behavioral and physiological responses that go with fear and anxiety, I thought of as being kind of like these subcortical states that, when they're activated, would trigger some kind of need to cognitively interpret. We're reviewing all of this stuff with split brain patients in terms of cognitive dissonance, that the patient would generate these confabulations to explain why a certain behavior was generated. And that was to reduce the dissonance of that results from the fact that we all believe we have free will. So it's uncomfortable to see our body producing a behavior that we didn't choose, we being the conscious person.
Yeah,
so
describe that a little bit, because you did these experiments in which you showed that the split brain, did know something had gone on, but couldn't articulate it.
Right. So basic idea is you present a picture, or we had a patient who could read in both hemispheres, which was unusual. So we were able to put words in the right hemisphere by you flash them to the left side of the visual space. The word goes to the right hemisphere, and normally that word would cross over to the left. But when the brain is split, it stays in the right hemisphere. So if the stand up, if like two words, stand up, the guy would stand up. You say, why'd you do that? He said, oh, I needed to stretch. Now we're talking to the left hemisphere, right? So the left hemisphere didn't know why he stood up, but he stood up, so there must be a reason. So he would generate that explanation. Or if the word was laugh, he'd go, ha ha. We say, why are you laughing? The guy would say, oh, you guys are so funny. And so it was like, never missing a beat. Those explanations were coming out.
Yeah, yeah.
So we propose that, this is not just true of the split brain, but in all of us, a lot of our behavior is controlled unconsciously. And when we unconsciously behave, we've got to, we're fortunate that our brain has some mechanism for generating those rationalizations, those narratives that re-explain everything, that, reduce the dissonance of violating free will.